Tonight we travel back through the centuries to the closing years of the 13th century. Scotland is a land of wide valleys, quiet forests, and scattered towns built of timber and stone. Small villages lie beside rivers and fields, where farmers work the land much as their families have done for generations. Shepherds guide their flocks across the hills. Merchants travel slowly along narrow roads carrying goods between towns. Life moves at a steady and familiar pace. Yet beneath this quiet rhythm, Scotland is passing through a time of great uncertainty. Only a few years earlier, the Scottish throne had become the centre of a growing dispute. When King Alexander III died unexpectedly in the year 1286, he left behind no clear adult heir to rule the kingdom. For a time, Scotland was governed by a group of guardians who attempted to keep the peace while a new ruler was chosen. Eventually, a nobleman named John Balliol was selected as king, but his reign soon placed Scotland under increasing pressure from its powerful neighbour to the south, England. The English king, Edward I, was an ambitious and determined ruler. He believed he had the authority to influence the affairs of Scotland. Over time, he began demanding loyalty from Scottish leaders and intervening in the decisions of the Scottish crown. Tension slowly grew between the two kingdoms. In the year 1296, these tensions finally erupted into open conflict. Edward I launched a powerful invasion of Scotland. English armies moved north across the border, capturing towns and castles along the way. Scottish forces were defeated in battle, and King John Balliol was eventually removed from the throne. With Scotland now under English control, many castles across the country were occupied by English garrisons. English officials were placed in positions of authority. Taxes were collected, laws were enforced, and the people of Scotland were expected to accept the rule of the English crown. For some, this new order brought a sense of uneasy stability. But for many others, it created deep resentment. Across the countryside, small groups of Scots began to resist the occupation. Some were minor nobles who had lost power under English rule. Others were ordinary men who believed their country should remain independent. At first, these acts of resistance were scattered and unorganized. But slowly, stories began to spread of individuals willing to challenge English authority. Among these figures was a man from the region of Renfrewshire, a man who would soon become one of the most remembered names in Scottish history. His name was William Wallace. At this point in the story, Wallace is still an unknown figure. He is not yet the famous warrior that later generations would remember. He is simply one man living in a country struggling under foreign rule. But before long, events will unfold that place him at the centre of Scotland's growing rebellion. And the quiet countryside of Scotland will once again become the setting for a new chapter in its long history of resistance. Little is known with certainty about the early life of William Wallace. The records from this period of Scottish history are limited, and many stories about Wallace were written long after his lifetime. Even so, historians believe that he was born sometime around the year 1270. Most accounts place his early life in the region of Renfrewshire in the west of Scotland. This was a landscape of rolling farmland, wooded hills, and small settlements connected by narrow roads. Families in this region often lived close to the land. Fields were worked with simple tools. Livestock grazed on open pasture, and communities relied heavily on one another for protection and survival. Wallace is believed to have come from a minor noble family. His father, often identified as Sir Malcolm Wallace, likely held a small estate in the area. Families like the Wallaces were not among the most powerful nobles of Scotland, but they were respected landholders who owed loyalty to the Scottish crown. Growing up in this environment, William Wallace would have been familiar with the responsibilities expected of a young nobleman. He may have learned to ride horses, handle weapons, and understand the customs of the local leadership. Education during this time often took place within monasteries or church schools, and some accounts suggest Wallace may have received basic instruction in reading and language. However, the Scotland of Wallace's youth was not a peaceful place. As English influence expanded across the country, tensions between local communities and English officials began to grow. Sheriffs and administrators appointed by the English crown were placed in towns throughout Scotland. Their role was to enforce English law and maintain control over the region. For many Scottish communities, this presence was deeply resented. Taxes increased, local authority was reduced, and many Scots felt that their traditions and freedoms were slowly being taken away. In towns and villages across the country, quiet anger began to spread. At first, these frustrations rarely led to open conflict. But in some places, small confrontations began to occur between local residents and English officials. It was within this atmosphere of growing tension that William Wallace first appears in historical accounts. The details vary depending on the source, but most stories agree that Wallace became involved in a dispute with English authority in the town of Lanark. The English sheriff there was a man named William de Hazelrig. He represented the power of the English crown in the region, and his presence would soon become connected with one of the earliest acts that brought William Wallace into the story of Scotland's resistance. What began as a local conflict would quickly grow into something much larger. Before long, the name William Wallace would begin to spread across Scotland, and the quiet resistance that had been building beneath the surface would finally begin to take shape as open rebellion. In the town of Lanark, located in the valley of the River Clyde, English authority was represented by the local sheriff. His name was William de Hazelrig. As sheriff, he was responsible for maintaining order and enforcing the laws of the English crown in the region. For many Scottish residents, the presence of English officials such as Hazelrig was a constant reminder that their country was now governed from outside its own borders. Tensions between local communities and English administrators were not uncommon during this time. Taxes were collected, rules were enforced, and disagreements sometimes arose between those who supported English authority and those who quietly resisted it. It was in this atmosphere that William Wallace became involved in an event that would soon spread his name across Scotland. The exact details are difficult to confirm, and different accounts tell the story in slightly different ways. But most versions agree that Wallace had a serious confrontation with Sheriff Hazelrig in Lanark. Some stories suggest that Wallace had already been seen as a troublesome figure by English officials. Others describe a personal dispute that escalated into violence. Whatever the exact circumstances, the outcome of the encounter was dramatic. William Wallace and a group of supporters attacked the sheriff in Lanark. During the confrontation, Sheriff Hazelrig was killed. The news spread quickly through the surrounding countryside. For English authorities, this was a direct challenge to their control. For many Scots, however, the event became a symbol of resistance. The killing of an English sheriff was not a small matter. It meant that Wallace could no longer remain simply a local figure. He had now become an open opponent of English rule. Soon after the incident, Wallace and his followers were forced to move quickly through the countryside. They travelled between forests, hills, and small villages, avoiding the forces that would certainly be searching for them. But rather than disappearing into hiding, Wallace began gathering support. Others who shared the same resentment toward English rule joined him. Small groups of fighters formed across different parts of the country. At first, these forces were scattered and loosely organised, yet their actions showed that resistance in Scotland was beginning to grow stronger. Raids were carried out against English garrisons. Supply routes were disrupted. Local officials were challenged. The rebellion was still in its early stages, but the atmosphere in Scotland was beginning to change. What had once been quiet frustration was now turning into organised opposition. And at the centre of these early efforts stood William Wallace, a man who only a short time earlier had been largely unknown. Now his name was spreading from village to village, from town to town, across a country that was slowly beginning to rise against foreign rule. As the rebellion in Scotland continued to grow, William Wallace soon found himself leading larger groups of fighters across the country. By the year 1297, resistance to English rule had spread across several regions. Local leaders began joining their forces together, hoping to challenge the English army more directly. One of these leaders was a Scottish nobleman named Andrew de Moray. Moray had begun raising forces in the north of Scotland, attacking English garrisons and gathering support among local communities. When Wallace and Moray eventually combined their armies, the rebellion gained new strength. Together, they prepared to face an English force advancing north toward the town of Stirling. Stirling held great importance in Scotland. The town sat beside the River Forth, where one of the main crossing points connected the northern and southern parts of the country. Near the town stood a narrow wooden bridge that crossed the river. Any army wishing to move through this region would likely need to pass over that bridge. In the early days of September 1297, the English army arrived near Stirling. It was led by experienced commanders and supported by large numbers of soldiers. The English force included heavily armoured knights, infantry, and archers. From a distance, the army would have appeared impressive and powerful. Yet the Scottish leaders understood that the narrow bridge might offer them an advantage. Wallace and Moray positioned their forces on the higher ground north of the river. From there they watched carefully as the English army prepared to cross. The bridge itself was narrow and could only allow a limited number of soldiers to cross at one time. For a while, both sides waited. The English commanders eventually decided to begin moving their troops across the bridge. Slowly, groups of soldiers began crossing the river. Knights, foot soldiers, and equipment moved carefully across the wooden structure. But as more English troops gathered on the far side of the river, the Scottish army saw their moment. Once a portion of the English army had crossed the bridge, Wallace and Moray ordered their forces to advance. Scottish soldiers moved quickly down from the higher ground. Their formations pushed toward the English troops, who had already crossed the river. Meanwhile, many of the English soldiers, who had not yet crossed, were unable to move forward quickly enough to support their comrades. The narrow bridge limited the movement of the army. As the Scottish forces advanced, the English troops on the northern side of the river found themselves in a difficult position. They were separated from the rest of their army and had little room to organise their defence. The battle that followed became a decisive victory for the Scottish forces. Many English soldiers were forced back toward the river. Some attempted to retreat across the bridge. Others tried to escape along the riverbanks. The crossing that had seemed so useful to the English army now became a barrier to their retreat. By the end of the day, the English army had suffered a serious defeat. The victory at Stirling Bridge quickly spread Wallace's reputation across Scotland. For many people, the battle showed that English forces could be challenged successfully. And William Wallace, once an unknown figure in the countryside, was now seen as one of the leading figures in Scotland's growing struggle for independence. The victory at Stirling Bridge changed the course of the rebellion in Scotland. News of the battle spread quickly across the country. For many Scots, it was the first clear sign that English rule could be challenged successfully. The defeat of a powerful English army had given the resistance new confidence. In the weeks that followed, William Wallace and Andrew de Moray were recognised as the leading commanders of the Scottish forces. Moray, however, had been seriously wounded during the battle. His injuries would soon prove fatal. With Moray gone, much of the responsibility for leading the Scottish resistance now fell upon Wallace. For a time, Wallace was appointed Guardian of Scotland. This position meant that he governed the country in the name of the absent Scottish king, John Balliol. As Guardian, Wallace attempted to organise the defence of the kingdom and strengthen the rebellion against English control. During this period, Scottish forces carried out campaigns across several regions of northern England. These expeditions were intended both to weaken English influence and to secure supplies for the Scottish army. Soldiers travelled south across the border, moving through towns and countryside that had previously supported the English occupation. Although these campaigns caused concern in England, Wallace understood that the conflict was far from finished. King Edward I remained a powerful and determined opponent. The English king had already built a reputation as a skilled military commander. He would not allow Scotland's rebellion to continue without response. As reports of Wallace's growing influence reached the English court, preparations began for a new campaign. Edward I gathered a large army, determined to march north and confront the Scottish forces directly. Once again, the fields and hills of Scotland would become the setting for another great battle. Wallace understood that the English army he would soon face was far larger and better equipped than the one defeated at Stirling Bridge. Even so, he continued to prepare his forces. Scottish soldiers gathered from different regions of the country. Spearmen trained in the defensive formations that had proven effective before, and scouts watched the roads and valleys for signs of the approaching English army. By the summer of the year 1298, both sides were preparing for another confrontation. This time, however, the battle would take place on the wide open ground near the town of Falkirk. There, the Scottish army would once again face the powerful forces of King Edward I, and the outcome would shape the next chapter of William Wallace's story. By the summer of the year 1298, the conflict between Scotland and England had entered a new phase. King Edward I had decided to lead his army north in person. Edward was an experienced commander who had already fought campaigns across Britain and beyond. He understood the importance of ending the Scottish rebellion before it could grow stronger. The English army he gathered was large and well equipped. Knights in heavy armour rode powerful horses. Archers carried the longbows that had become one of England's most effective weapons. Infantry soldiers marched with shields, spears, and swords. As the army travelled north, villages and towns along the way prepared for the arrival of the king's forces. Meanwhile, William Wallace and the Scottish army moved carefully across the countryside. Wallace knew that his army was smaller than the English force advancing toward him. Even so, he prepared his soldiers to meet the challenge. The Scottish army gathered near the town of Falkirk, not far from the River Forth. The landscape here was open and wide, with fields and patches of woodland stretching across the land. Unlike the narrow crossing at Stirling Bridge, the ground at Falkirk offered much more space for large armies to manoeuvre. Wallace arranged his soldiers in the same defensive formations that had proven effective before. Groups of spearmen formed tight circles known as schiltrons. Each soldier stood close beside the next, holding long spears outward to create a defensive barrier. Between these formations stood smaller groups of archers. Mounted knights from among the Scottish nobles waited nearby with their horses. As the English army approached the battlefield, the two sides prepared for what would soon become a difficult confrontation. At first, the Scottish formations held their ground. But the English army brought with it a powerful advantage: large numbers of skilled longbowmen. English archers moved forward and began firing arrows toward the Scottish lines. Wave after wave of arrows fell across the battlefield. The Scottish archers, who were fewer in number, struggled to respond. Meanwhile, English cavalry searched for openings between the Scottish formations. The battle gradually became more difficult for Wallace's army. Although the schiltrons remained strong defensive positions, the constant pressure from archers and cavalry began to weaken the Scottish lines. As the fighting continued, some of the mounted Scottish nobles withdrew from the field. Without their support, the Scottish army found it increasingly difficult to maintain its position. Eventually, the battle turned in favour of the English forces. Wallace realised that continuing the fight would only lead to further losses. The Scottish army slowly withdrew from the battlefield. Although the defeat at Falkirk was a serious setback, the rebellion itself did not end. William Wallace stepped down from his position as Guardian of Scotland soon after the battle. But the struggle for Scottish independence would continue, and Wallace himself would remain an important figure in that story. After the defeat at Falkirk, William Wallace stepped down from his role as Guardian of Scotland. The responsibility for leading the Scottish resistance was passed to other noble leaders, including Robert the Bruce and John Comyn. Although Wallace was no longer the official leader of the rebellion, he did not disappear from the struggle. Instead, he continued working in support of Scotland's cause in different ways. For a time, Wallace travelled beyond Scotland itself. Historical records suggest that he journeyed across Europe, seeking assistance from allies who might support the Scottish effort against English rule. One destination was the court of the King of France. France and England had long been rivals, and Scottish leaders hoped that this rivalry might lead to support for their struggle. The details of Wallace's travels are not fully known. The records from this period are limited, and many stories have been shaped by later writers. However, it is widely believed that Wallace spent several years moving between different regions, attempting to gather diplomatic support for Scotland. Meanwhile, the conflict within Scotland continued. Different Scottish leaders fought to maintain resistance against English control. Some castles changed hands several times. Battles and skirmishes continued across the countryside. Although Wallace was no longer the central commander of the rebellion, his earlier victories had already secured him a place among the most important figures in the struggle. His name had become widely known throughout Scotland. Stories about his actions were repeated in villages, towns, and camps of Scottish soldiers. For many people, Wallace represented the determination to defend Scotland's independence. Eventually, Wallace returned to Scotland. But by this time, the political landscape had changed once again. English forces still maintained a strong presence in many parts of the country, and the danger for anyone openly opposing English authority remained very real. For several years, Wallace continued to move quietly through the country. But in the year 1305, his long struggle would come to a sudden and tragic end. In circumstances that are still debated by historians, Wallace was captured by forces loyal to the English crown. His capture would bring him before the English king in London, and there the story of William Wallace would reach its final chapter. In the summer of the year 1305, William Wallace's long struggle finally came to an end. For several years he had continued moving quietly across Scotland, avoiding English forces and remaining connected to the resistance. But during this time, the English crown had never stopped searching for him. King Edward I considered Wallace one of the most important figures behind the Scottish rebellion. Capturing him had become a priority for English authorities. Eventually, Wallace was betrayed and captured near Glasgow. The exact circumstances are still debated by historians. Many accounts suggest that he was seized by men loyal to the English crown and quickly placed under heavy guard. From Scotland, he was taken south to London. The journey would have taken several days, travelling along the roads that connected the two kingdoms. Along the way, Wallace would have passed through towns and countryside that were now firmly under English control. When he arrived in London, he was brought before English officials and placed on trial. The charges against him were serious. He was accused of treason against the English crown. From the perspective of the English authorities, Wallace had led a rebellion against the king. But Wallace himself is said to have responded that he could not be guilty of treason to Edward I. He had never sworn loyalty to the English king. Instead, he had always fought for Scotland. The trial did not last long. The outcome had already been decided. William Wallace was sentenced to death. His execution took place in London in August of 1305. The punishment was intended to send a clear message to anyone who might challenge English authority. Yet in the years that followed, the story of Wallace did not fade. Instead, his name continued to spread across Scotland. To some, he became a symbol of resistance. To others, he represented the determination of a nation that refused to surrender its independence. Although Wallace did not live to see Scotland regain its freedom, the struggle continued. Only a few years later, another Scottish leader would achieve a famous victory at Bannockburn, and the memory of William Wallace would remain closely connected to the long story of Scotland's fight for independence. Today, many centuries after the life of William Wallace, the landscapes of Scotland remain quiet and enduring. Across the country, rivers still wind through green valleys. Forests stretch across the hills, and small towns stand where communities have lived for generations. In places like Stirling and Falkirk, visitors can walk through fields that were once the setting for moments of great importance in Scottish history. Yet these landscapes often appear peaceful and unchanged. Birdsong drifts across the open countryside. Wind moves gently through the grasses, and the land itself carries little sign of the conflicts that once unfolded there. The story of William Wallace has been remembered for more than 700 years. It has been told in chronicles, poems, songs, and later in books and films. Some details have been debated by historians. Others have grown into legend over time, but the central part of the story remains clear. Wallace became one of the earliest and most determined leaders in Scotland's struggle for independence. His actions inspired others, who would continue that struggle in the years that followed. Not long after Wallace's death, Robert the Bruce would rise to lead Scotland's resistance, and in the year 1314, the victory at Bannockburn would mark a turning point in the long conflict with England. In this way, the story of Wallace became part of a much larger chapter in Scottish history. Today, statues and monuments across Scotland remember his life. In the city of Stirling, a tall monument stands high above the surrounding countryside, looking out across the landscape where Wallace once fought. From its tower, visitors can see the rivers, fields, and hills that have witnessed centuries of history. Yet beyond the monuments and stories, the land itself continues quietly onward. Seasons change, rivers flow, and the countryside of Scotland remains as calm and enduring as it was long ago. And somewhere within those quiet landscapes, the memory of William Wallace still echoes softly through the long history of Scotland. If you enjoyed this calm journey into Scotland's past, you may also enjoy another peaceful story exploring the streets of Edinburgh in the year 1700. You can find that story here. Until then, thank you for listening, and rest well.